And joining us now here in studio, Alison Loat, who is with Samara. And that's an organization devoted to studying citizen engagement with Canadian democracy. And you know the first question I always like to ask you. What's a Samara?
A Samara is the winged helicopter seed that comes from a maple tree or an elm tree in the fall.
And I ask you because I know people are going to email and ask me, what's a Samara? So we deal with that off the top.
I've only ever met one person that knew before I told them.
There you go.
Yep.
That's why we do it. Okay, this is your third visit to our station to do these one-on-one interviews about the big project that Samara is working on. So again, refresh our memory as to what project you're working on.
Well, Samara is a charitable organization that studies citizens' engagement with Canada's democracy. And so as a way to do that and kick that off, we thought we would do Canada's first ever series of exit interviews with 65 former members of Parliament who come from all across the country and every political party. Ask them a little bit about what's it like on the front lines of our democracy, so to speak, what worked well, what didn't, and what advice would you have on how to improve Parliament for the service of all Canadians.
So your first visit here, you looked into how MPs got into politics. The second visit was their orientation in Ottawa once they got there. The third report looks at what?
It studies their, well, it explains how they said they spent their time in Parliament and their relationship with their political parties.
How they spent their time. Did they spend it well?
On the whole, they said they did
at
the end, when all was said and done. And this was actually one of the conflicts in the entire series, is that while they were very free in sharing some of the frustrations and annoyances they felt, they also said they came to Parliament full of awe and wonder and a belief in the importance of the institution, and they left feeling that notwithstanding the challenges that public life throws on people, it was time well spent, and they all felt like it was something that, most felt it was something that they would happily do again. So there was a bit of a contradiction in that, but probably at the end that was a bit of a happy story.
You have a chart in your report, and we're going to take a little while. Let's put this up, Michael, and we're going to take a little while to go through this because it's a bit complicated. We're talking about the quality of the work versus the openness of how they did it. And if you look on the left side of this chart, you can see what gets the most publicity and takes place in public and open. And that, of course, high visibility in question period, a little less so in House duty, a little less so in committee work, and of course caucus work very much behind closed doors. But then look in the right-hand column and you see how that arrow gets bigger in size with the quality of the work accomplished as you go down the chart. So question period, not much accomplished. House duty, a little less, a little more. Committee work, a little more. Caucus work, a lot more. And I guess the question is, how come so much of, the good important work is taking place away from what people can see, and so much of the irrelevancy takes place where we can see it?
Yeah, this was a bit of a sad observation that they made, which was that really they were embarrassed about the public displays of politics in the House of Commons. Voting, question period, that sort of thing, they described as either sort of juvenile or frustrating, or sometimes more like theater, or even a waste of time. And they almost all said that their real work, quote unquote, was done in private. So why was that? Well, when we asked them why, there was really a big reason, and it was that they said it was essentially the incentives that were put upon them, often by their political parties, to act a certain way in public, and a way that, frankly, they were embarrassed about, and they worried dramatically how it impacted citizens' perception of politics. And so instead, that said they forced them to actually do anything constructive behind closed doors.
So
often.
The more partisan you act, the more of a trained seal you are, the more you showboat in front of the cameras. The people who make the decisions about whether you go up or down the ladder, they like that more.
That's what
how it works.
That's what a lot of the MPs insinuated, but it went a bit further than that. Even they often described, and they used this word "the party" quite vaguely. Whether they were talking about the party leadership or political staffers or other parliamentarians was not always clear. But what a lot of them did say is that they felt that the decisions that were made by the leadership and the party were often opaque, untransparent. There wasn't a lot of opportunity, they felt, for them as members of Parliament to either understand why decisions were being made or to influence them in the extent they might have liked to.
Almost every member of Parliament I've ever talked to has said, while question period is very theatrical, and if you're a real nerd for politics, there's some fun in watching it, they said what you said, which is it's a waste of time, and we act in a juvenile fashion. And there seems to be such an appetite to change it across the floor, but it never changes. Why not?
Yeah, that was, again, a big frustration with this, is if everyone's so consistently unhappy, why isn't anything done to change it? And I think that upon reflection, there's probably many reasons, but at least two. One of them is it's actually perhaps a rational response to being a member of Parliament, because as many people found out in a recent election, your job security is not guaranteed when you're in elected office.
No kidding.
And many of them do come in with an idea of what they want to accomplish. And when they arrive and they say, do you think, oh, I want to spend my time trying to change the party incentive structure and this complex, opaque system, or do I want to get to work in the service of my constituents in the way that I said I did? I don't know how long I'm going to be here, so sometimes it's a lot more rational to say, I'm going to focus on the work of this committee, or in my constituency, or in my caucus, because at least I can get something done there. So I think that's quite a rational response.
Is that rewarded, that sort of hard-slogging committee work, which often happens behind closed doors, and certainly media almost never cover? I mean, do you get rewarded for doing that?
Many of them, they don't say you don't, but they know you don't, but they don't actually mind it all that much. And in fact, a lot of them worried too much sometimes if we started to put cameras into committees, what might happen. I think a lot of why they do, it's sort of again in reflection, why they do emphasize so much all this time that they spend behind closed doors is because they almost want to say, look at us. It's not like that man you see on TV. There are real things happening here.
Well, here's a quote from the report, because I do want to follow up on this question period business, and everybody says it actually harms the image of politicians and misrepresents what we do. What we do actually is far more. Anyway, here's the quote. If the MPs so deplore their own public behavior, even fearing that it would turn people away from politics, why would they not act to change it? And the answer is?
Well, as I said, I think partially it is a rational response. Do I want to try to change this opaque system, or do I want to get to work in some other area?
Well, some guy Michael Chong put some ideas forward, and I mean, he got some uptake, but nothing's happened yet.
This leads to the second reason, and this is one they spoke a lot more about, which it is, they blame their political party. It's funny because so much of the discourse around Parliament is, our Parliament is dysfunctional, and I believe you've had discussions on this show about that very subject. And if you actually listen to what the MPs are saying, they suggest that we may be pointing our fingers in the wrong direction. It may not be Parliament and its rules that are the problem, but actually our political party, how we're organized, how we're structured, what incentives they place on members of Parliament and themselves that is actually the problem, and maybe that's a discussion that we should be having. So that's I think, again, why they said we didn't change it is the political party. They blame, and you think if these are the stalwarts of a party, I mean, arguably a member of Parliament benefits more than anybody else from political party membership. If they're not happy and they feel poked in the eye, is it any wonder why citizens are not engaging through these vehicles?
I wonder if part of the problem as well is that most of the members of Parliament, notwithstanding all the children we're hearing about having just been elected, but, they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. And, the whiz kids running the political offices of the parties are all in their 20s. How much of this is, I can't stand taking orders from somebody who's half or a third my age?
A couple of people mentioned that, but again, I think a lot of members of Parliament, and we don't give them enough credit for this, they usually come from actually quite an active background of accomplishment in their communities all across Canada. And so again, it's, do I want to sit here and get caught up in some opaque party structure, or do I just want to get on with it? And so I think a lot of them, at least in our conversations with them, they didn't overemphasize this. They kind of recognized it and were frustrated by it, but then wanted to go on and carry on and talk about how, they actually do get things done. And that was actually one of the nice parts about this, for all the frustrations that they expressed, a lot more, I realized, having done these interviews, gets accomplished than we ever recognize or probably give ourselves credit for as a country.
I wonder if media are part of the problem then, because of course media love to cover the food fight, but the sort of daily grunt constituency work that goes on, or the work in committees that goes on, we almost never cover.
Well, one of the surprises from these reports is that they've all been about things we didn't think they'd be about. We actually had a whole section of the interview. We had the same hypothesis as you. We had a whole section of the interviews devoted to the media. Wanted them to talk about their experience in working with the media. And we actually found they shoved those questions aside and continually came back to their political parties, questions that we didn't actually set out to ask them. So again, it's, where are we pointing the finger? I think they all accept the media is there and it's a presence, but their critical comments were much more often levied at their parties.
Interesting. Okay, you compared the daily life of an MP to that of the owner of a national franchise. How are they alike?
Well, it's almost, being an MP is almost like owning your local, Tim Hortons or your coffee shop on your corner, in the sense that you do well there because you know your community, you serve it well, you know the right location, you're there providing a service and you know your customers. But the truth is that you wouldn't be as successful if you didn't have a larger national company that was telling you what coffee to serve at what temperature, for what price, and in what frequency. And so the same tensions that exist where you may have a local preference that doesn't align with a national one is very much what MPs described as being a combination of their local representative, knowing, of course, that their well-being as an MP was heavily dependent on the brand of their political party and their leader.
I think we found that out this, in this past election very clearly. There are a lot of people who lost their seats, not because they were lousy MPs, but because the people didn't like the color of their party in that election.
Yeah, and so those tensions are the MPs express, and again, I think why they kept coming back to feeling frustrated about their parties, they didn't feel that those tensions were necessarily very effectively managed, even recognized, and that often frustrated the MPs.
Let me read another quote from your report. Political parties are organizations made up of citizens. Reforming them, therefore, requires citizen participation. However, it would seem that we are currently in a vicious circle. Parties need to be renewed, but parties turn people off from politics. Disengaged citizens do not want to join parties, and so parties are not being renewed or reformed in the direction the citizenry would like. This is, quite clearly, a vicious circle for infinity. How do you break that?
Well, I think a first step is to actually identify that as the problem. Again, back to what I had said before, it's often about Parliament, but these MPs suggest we should look somewhere else. So I thank them for that. The second is I think we have to remind ourselves that political parties play an extremely important role in our democracy. They're responsible for engaging citizens in politics, identifying candidates. They are meant to aggregate different policy perspectives from across the country, and of course they contest elections. We need all those things to happen in a democracy. But if what the MPs tell us is true, they're not doing that very well. So what are some discussions we should have? First of all, is the public money that is going into political parties, is it being spent in the direction, even nice and equitably across those 4 roles that I outlined? The answer is no. Almost all of it is spent on advertising and contesting elections.
What should it be on?
Well, I would argue a better balance across the 4 would be nice. There could be part of it spent on trying to think really how do we engage citizens in the politics of their community every day. I think riding associations and constituency offices can play a role there. Policy development. There's very little investment made in public policy in our political parties. A number of European parties actually have public policy foundations, recognizing how critical it is to try to bring together a diversity of views into a direction a country should take. So perhaps we could consider taking part of the public money that goes into our political parties and putting that aside into a policy development function and figuring out how we can actually engage people through parties in the development of ideas that can shape the future of this country. So those are just a few things that I would love people to talk to, and I think the MPs in their own way were bringing up through their articulating their own frustration with the political parties.
One last thing. What about the role of former MPs? I always got a sense when I visited Parliament Hill or at Queen's Park that, once you're out, they don't want to hear from you anymore. And you may have been in for 20 years and you may have a lot of experience and some good advice to share, but once you're gone, they don't want to know from you. Did the MPs that you talked to express that frustration?
A few definitely did. They all got into this because of a belief in the importance of public service and Parliament. And we have a tremendous asset in the experiences of these people that we aren't using. Exit interviews, for example, are done in all kinds of organizations, public and private, and they've never before been done in one of the most important workplaces in our country, our Parliament. I mean, that in itself is a statement. I mean, the good news about this is many of the MPs we spoke to, as well as the Association of Former Parliamentarians who are a partner in this project, they're very keen to assist in a mentorship or advice capacity to incoming MPs, which I know that they're actively talking about and working with in Ottawa, and hopefully that's at least one small way that that contribution can grow. They're also very busy, very interested in visiting schools. So if there's any teachers watching, you can call the association, and I know they'd be delighted to find a former member of Parliament to come in and talk to the students, but what it's like in practice. Of course, they're a little freer now, and they can speak openly, of course, and they have a little more time. So I know that they have a program to facilitate that, and they would love to hear from anybody.
I wonder if part of the issue is that nobody ever thinks you're really ever finally and permanently out of politics, and they're concerned about giving a platform to an ex-MP who, may want to come back in. And, in that case, you're a threat to the existing order. I wonder, is that part of it?
I'm not sure. The only reason people really said no to participate in the exit interviews is because they wanted to run again. So they've I don't want to, I'm not a former quite yet.
Right.
So that was the only reason that they said no. I think they're, actually, one of the things a number of them did say was that they don't hear from their parties again. And they, several said, I'd be delighted to help, but the leader comes through my community, I don't even hear from them. So I'm not so sure. I think there is still a lot of willingness and energy to support in whatever way that they can. And again, it's much like we have elders, a culture of elders in certain First Nations communities. I mean, there is a very similar parallel here in trying to learn from the experiences of those who've been before and putting those to the use to the improvement of a community or a country.
Gotcha. Alison, good to have you back in at TVO, and see you again soon, I'm sure.
Thank you very much.